This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for joining today's tale from talk from the tales, right? So, so today's topic is about disaster preparedness and disaster risk reduction. I'm just going to start with some of the basics and global frameworks, and then going into local examples using Sri Lanka as a case study. So the content of this presentation will be first disaster management, just some trends and concepts. Then I will just talk about Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is the overall guiding framework at global level and national level. Then some of the key stakeholders in disaster preparedness or disaster risk reduction. Then some of the concepts which has been in the which has been practiced in the field for a long time is committee-based disaster risk reduction. We call it CBDRR or CBDRM. And in Sri Lanka, after CBDRM, there was a shift to decentralized disaster risk reduction, DDRR, which I will briefly touch. And then the shift on community resilience to disasters, mainly after Sendai framework, adoption of Sendai framework in 2015. And the next I'll be talking about how to operationalize the community resilience frameworks or community resilience concepts at the field level, at the community level, where the new concept also brought very recently called risk sensitive development, where DRR, disaster risk reduction, is mainstreamed in all the development activities, even in sometimes in response as well. So from there I will take to the promotion of integrated approach to disaster risk reduction, which is now gaining more prominent at the global level. And then finally some funding opportunities, or we can jointly discuss what are the possible funding opportunities for future programming. So to start with, just refresh everybody's mind on the disaster terminology. There are so much different terminologies used by different practitioners, researchers, policymakers. So yeah, these are the main terms that are used in disaster management. So it's about disaster risk, and which includes hazard, vulnerability, capacity, which is a function of hazard, vulnerability, and capacity, and that is correlated to resilience. And we will go to the next slide on disaster management cycle, where you will see different phases of disasters. So it's about prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction, development. So this is the disaster management cycle, where you will see some of the terms here. So these are the main terms that are used in disaster management terminology. And in addition, we have early warning systems, critical infrastructure, economic loss, which is this year's thematic target for International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction by UNISDR. So these are some of the terms that we just need to understand before we move to disaster management. And some basics about assessing risks, which is the founding stone of disaster risk management. We need to first assess risk. So risk is about hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And we have a hazard. that we know the potential of any natural phenomena, exposure, which is infrastructure and population, and again vulnerability, the likelihood of the damage due to this hazard event, and we will have impact as a result. And the risk is composite of all these four elements. And again, there are different definitions. I am not going to go into those details, but just to refresh our mind, these are the key elements in assessing risk. So before I move into more detail about Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is the global framework adopted in 2015, it's a 15 years framework, 2015 to 2030. So this is the timeline that the international commitments to disaster risk reduction has been happening for the last 25 years. So you can see in 1989, the UN has started International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. Then it goes for Yokohama Strategy for Plan of Actions. Then in 1999, International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, ISDR, was formed. And in 2005, this is the main turning point because of after 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Hoygo Framework for Action, HFA, is adopted for 10 years from 2005 to 2015. And when this HFA is over, then in 2015, Sendai Framework is adopted. Now, the key point here is to make here is to understand about Sendai Framework, which was adopted in 2015, where two other frameworks were also adopted at global level to mainstream this disaster risk reduction. So the other one is climate change conference of parties agreement, which is shortly called COP21, and now there are COP20, I think 24. So it is a conference of parties of all the states coming together to sign a climate change agreement. And in line with that, we know the SDGs 2015, 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which was coming from the Millennium Development Goals from 2000. So in 2015, we can see these three frameworks which were adopted globally, and there is now more talk of integrated approach on this, which I will talk at the end of this presentation. So before I move into more details of Sendai framework, just for us to know where, I mean, my focus of today's presentation will be mainly on preparedness and mitigation. And as we know, maybe field is more working on response and recovery. But after first disaster, we respond, but it is the phase also, it is a pre-preparedness phase for the next disaster. So when disasters occur, we respond and there will be a recovery phase, but it is also the phase of mitigation and prevention, mitigation, and preparedness for the next disaster. So that is where the concept of disaster risk reduction, mainstreaming disaster risk reduction, comes in. So whenever we do some work, whether it is response, recovery, or development, we need to integrate the disaster risks and also climate change risk or climate risks. So, and again, there are many different ways of presenting different disaster management phases, and this is just one example. And different phases can happen parallelly as well. So yeah, this is not one after the other. And so today's presentation will be mainly focusing on this preparedness and mitigation part. Sendai framework for disaster reduction. I will give some brief focus or details about what it contains. And as we know, it advocates for strengthening risk reduction approach, and UN member states adopted it in 2015, and it is endorsed by UN General Assembly. And there is a big move at national level to really implement this. What it contains, mainly it contains 4 priority areas, just for us to remember easily, and 7 targets. So these are the 7 targets. If you look at on the right side of the slide, there are 4 targets that are to reduce the disaster mortality, number of people affected by disasters, and damage, economic loss and damage, and to damage to the infrastructure. And there are 3 targets that are there to increase the DRR national local level strategies by 2020. It's 2020, and international cooperation by 2030, and then early warning systems and disaster risk information by 2030. So these are the 7 targets, and most of the work that the different countries do are aligned with these targets at the global level. And outcome, as we know, it's to reduce the disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and it's very self-explanatory, so I don't want to read that. Goal is to prevent the new disaster risk or reduce the existing disaster risks, and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability, and to increase the preparedness for response. So if you look at this goal, there are 4 elements. Those are the 4 priorities. So first priority is understand the disaster risk. Second priority is to strengthen the disaster risk governance, and third is to invest in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and finally the 4th priority is to enhance disaster preparedness for better response. So these are the key 4 priority areas, and almost all the projects are aligned with these 4 priorities, or either one or more than one. So I will just explain this each priority using a Sri Lankan example, which is funded by ECHO, DIP ECHO project, Disaster Preparedness of European Commission Humanitarian Aid Project. So the first priority is understanding disaster risk, where the information is the key. So understanding disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure, and hazards, characteristics, and the environment, which includes scientific and indigenous data or traditional data, promotion of risk knowledge, dissemination of information, and then based on that we will do awareness raising at multiple levels, including community, local government, and regional and national government. So this priority area is mainly talking about pre-disaster risk assessment. And if you see, I have just put a map which shows which is a risk assessment map, a multi-hazard risk assessment map, where you can see different hazards, vulnerabilities, and the capacity of the people. That is how we produce the risk assessment maps. And it is a multi-stakeholder led process, not only community, but also it includes local authorities and all the local level stakeholders. Second priority is strengthening disaster risk governance, so which is where we build the capacity of the of different levels of state departments, from national, regional, and even global, and also local level. And then we foster collaboration and partnership across different mechanisms and institutions, because there are many sectors involved, and we need to build capacities of different sectors and different institutions. So competency building of local bodies by providing training and technical, financial, administrative support, and also capacity building. And we also assign roles and tasks to different institutions because it's very complex and it cut across different sectors, almost all the sectors. So often the problem is the roles and responsibilities of institutions. So there should be a proper assignment of roles and responsibilities. So the outcome of this process will be the integration of disaster risk assessment across different sectors. So by understanding the risk, we produce pre-disaster risk assessment reports or assessment. Based on that, we will integrate different disaster risk mechanisms in different sectors. Third is on real implementation, which is investing in disaster risk reduction. So this is more of public and private investment in disaster risk reduction through structural and non-structural measures. You can see some of the examples of structural measures on the right side, which were implemented through the DPECO project in Sri Lanka. So this may include allocation of resources and disaster risk transfer program like insurances and mainstreaming risk assessment in land use policy, which is a major issue, property land use policy, and designing and implementation of the policy at the local level. So as a result of this, we will have risk reduction policy and real implementation. And as part of the DPECO project, it's very pilot project. So we only demonstrate how the mitigation work could be, and it is not a full-scale implementation. The government is supposed to implement the full mitigation work. So through this, the grants from international donors, it is only a pilot project which demonstrate how we can reduce disaster risk, and government has to take the role of upscaling it. Finally, we also need to enhance the disaster preparedness for effective response. So this is where the disaster preparedness part comes in. So integrate lessons learned from the past disasters to strengthen the disaster preparedness for response and take actions in anticipation of future events, emerging events. So when we even respond to a disaster, we should prepare the community to prepare for next disasters. So that is where we provide capacity buildings, and capacities are in place for effective response and recovery at all levels. This could include human resource capacity, technical capacity, physical assets. And early warning system is very key for any effective response, preparedness and response. So multi-hazard early warning system is included in this priority. Strengthen the stockpiling, volunteer force, and all disaster preparedness pillars, and integrate disaster risk reduction and response preparedness. So what we will have at the end of this action, we will have a proper disaster response preparedness plan, so that can be really applied after actual disaster. So I have just explained an example using DPECO, how these 4 priority actions were taken into account in one project in Sri Lanka. Now I'll just move to the other gaining momentum in this disaster management sector is about resilience. So a lot of people now talk about resilience. There are very complex models from academic literature, but I have just only taken this one just to explain what is resilience. So yeah, so we have one normal linear line where it's a normal situation and it is a resilient community, but when disasters occur, there is a setback. and people come back to people come back to the original status, or maybe less than original status. So there are two components in resilience. One is the time taken to recover, which we call is rapidity, how rapidly people can recover. That is one part of resilience. The second part of resilience is the robustness, how far people can get back to their previous status or better than previous status, build back better. So these are the two key elements in disaster resilience. So with this in mind, I will just take you through some of the transformation of different concepts in the context of Sri Lanka, and this is also common in some other parts of the world. So before tsunami, Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, the focus were mainly on disaster response and disaster preparedness for disaster response. So most of the work were done by the government through social service department. There was no dedicated mechanism for disaster management. So there is a social service department that works on disaster management through social safety programs and some small scale disaster preparedness work. But after 2004 tsunami, there has been a major shift, and new legislation on disaster management was passed in the parliament, and the focus was more on preparing communities and reducing the disaster risk. But at that time, it was driven by external funding by NGOs, because government did not have enough capacity, because they were just beginning to learn, and then change the system. So most of the work were done on community-based disaster risk management promoted by NGOs, and this is mainly driven by the community, but through the external funding by NGOs. Then there were a lot of lessons learned from this process, and the new concept also emerged called decentralized disaster risk management, where CBDRM, to some extent it failed because lack of involvement of local authorities, because NGOs go and work in the community, but they fail to link the local authorities and the state mechanisms. So sustainability was questioned, and state responsibility was undermined. So they promoted decentralized disaster risk management, where different stakeholders come together. So this was actually happening at the time before 2015, during the period of HFA, HOIGO framework for action. But after 2015, after the Sendai framework, then community resilience concept has gained momentum. So the focus has shifted towards a development-centered approach, where we integrate risks sensitive or disaster risk reduction into development, which is called risk sensitive development. So this agenda is now being taken forward since 2015, and it is multi-stakeholder driven, not only communities but also with other key stakeholders in different levels at local level with different stakeholders. So this is how the disaster risk reduction has transformed. I explained using in Sri Lanka, but I think in most of the countries. So why is risk sensitive development is important? Because they go hand in hand. Like development and disaster risk reduction should go hand in hand, and development activities is our priority, but DRR is mainstream within development activities. So that is where we call it risk sensitive development. It's not a disaster risk reduction is not a separate action. It is part of development activities. So if you look at the diagrams A, B, C, D on the right side, it is D. That is where we now give more focus. In the past, it used to be A, B, C, but it's now more of D. And if you look at the left diagram, which shows the linkage between development and disaster risks. So our aim is to reduce the disaster risk in development. So that is where it is focused more on first quadrant. Yeah. So as I said before, in 2015, at global level, there were 3 frameworks adopted: climate change through this COP, Conference of Parties Agreement, disaster risk reduction through Sendai, and development through Sendai frameworks. So this is also adopted at the national level. So you have a development strategy, but disaster risk management and climate change management are integrated as an integrated approach to build resilient communities. So this is the focus now, and also in the coming years. So yeah, I just put the definition for density development as I explained before. I don't need to repeat it. So it is basically also following the linkages between 3 global instruments: Sustainable Development Goals, Sendai Framework, and Climate Change Convention. Yeah, it is a I just put how it is linked. So there are some studies, and this need has been realized more because of disintegrated approaches, and it's not an effective way of working. So we need to bring different sections together. So even in the Sustainable Development Goals, we can see how disaster risk is integrated, how climate change strategies are also included. So this slide just shows how these 3 come together at the global level. So most of the projects now promote this approach, where we bring the development, we bring the risk reduction and climate change adaptation through development, rather than doing separate disaster risk reduction projects, separate climate change projects. But this has been a problem in the field actually because of a lot of institutional issues. But this is what the government is now trying to do. Yeah, so I mean, as you know, disaster management is a very vast subject, so there are so many things that I can talk, but I just thought this will be useful for us. So I just explained what is maybe most relevant, and then finally I just thought just put a slide on global funding opportunities. There are global facility for disaster risk reduction and recovery, GFDRR, which is also partnered with, I think it's initiated through World Bank. They're giving a lot of money on disaster risk reduction, and there is also an innovation lab which is mainly focusing on risk information. It's mostly about data through new technologies, and like GIS, OpenStreetMaps, and yeah, so it's mostly about data innovation. And as I said, it's DPECO, the European Commission, is funding different programs. So ECHO is funding, even European Union Development Arm is also funding different programs. And then there are regional platforms for DRR. For example, for Asia, there's the Asian Disaster Risk Reduction Network, and there are even South Asian ministerial conferences. So different regional platforms are there. They're also funding at national level. And IFRC and NGOs, Oxfam, UNDP are some of the agencies which also provide, work on this. I think I'll stop at that point, and we can discuss further. And last Saturday, it was an International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and this year's theme was to target the third target of Sendai framework, which is to reduce the economic losses due to disasters. Yeah, so these are some of the useful links. I will share this presentation so you can go through the links. Yeah, I think I'll stop at that point. If you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you, Saja. It's really great presentation, and I hope everyone appreciates the depth that you've gone into this and the real technical expertise you have. I've certainly learned a whole bunch on this on your presentation, so I appreciate that a lot. So others know we do have a summary of a technical paper on our blog in line with that DRR day that Saja just mentioned, which just occurred, so fresh off over the weekend. I wonder, it'd be great if people could respond with their impressions, even if you don't have an explicit question, because as Saja mentioned, this this is sort of a budding area in our work. We mostly focus on the relief and reconstruction phases of things, so after something's happened, which is a critical time, but we'd like to do more before that, and especially as our whole approach and our global footprint increases, the opportunities to do something beforehand, as it were, is important, because I think we all agree, or certainly know the aphorism that a pinch of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or something like that. So, and this certainly falls in line with that, and I like the idea of being risk sensitive, even in those areas that we're working. Certainly in Nepal and the South Pacific, these are kinds of things that we're implementing, and like to see more of that spread as our activities grow. But maybe for those of you who are on the call listening to this, again, if you don't have an explicit question, it'd be good to hear if this relates to some of our work and that kind of thing. Give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think it's a good reflection, maybe to reflect on what field is already doing is a good way to, yeah. So
Okay, maybe Cat's got their tongue. But Bryn, Dan, Ben, Aziz, it'd be good. So Saja, I'm not sure if you saw that Ben added to the chat this point about language being you know, as he said, not to be much in-depth knowledge or subtlety around the use of the vocabulary. For instance, resilience and preparedness are often used interchangeably as if they are synonyms, but they're clearly not. And Sasha, maybe you could clarify how those are different, just in brief, very briefly.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, they're not same. I mean, preparedness, resilience is more than preparedness. So, in the past or at the beginning, resilience was was defined as the ability of the communities to recover back. So how resilient are they? I mean, that shows their level of resilience. But it is not. It is a kind of it's a passive way of looking at it. So we need to look at also proactively. I mean, resilience is also is also a component before disasters. So how people mitigate the risk, how people prepare for the impact of disasters, how they reduce the impact of disasters. So resilience is not only about preparedness, but also the ability of reducing the risk, ability of preparing for disasters to reduce the impact, and also the ability of coming back or recover back very quickly to their previous level of status or to a better status. So yeah, so, I mean, resilience was defined reactively in the past, but now it is recognized as a kind of a it cut across all different phases of disasters. I hope it clarifies.
Thank you. And should we talk about any next steps, Saja, the things that you're working on around this, and what we might do as an organization to try and get others to pick up some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we can see how the existing programs, or maybe in the upcoming programs, to include this risk sensitive part, where anything that we do after disasters in the response phase or recovery phase, we also need to make sure that it is risk sensitive to the next disasters. So any makerspace or any new product or any new initiative, it is better to include some ideas of integrating risk reduction approaches. Because I mean, if you look at the resilience concept, I mean, there are 5 different areas: infrastructure resilience, economic resilience, social resilience, institutional resilience, and environmental resilience. So the work that Field Ready is doing, I mean, can be integrated on all these resilience aspects as well. So yeah, I think there are a lot of possibilities we can see. And in the upcoming proposal, if we can just brainstorm on ideas how the risk sensitive part or the resilience strategies integrated, because most of the donors as well, I think, now wants to see more of this, right?
Yeah, and have you reviewed our risk analysis tool?
No.
And if you want to comment on how this might apply. I'm sorry, Sasha, go ahead.
Sorry, which risk analysis tool?
So Field Ready has a fairly in-depth risk analysis tool for looking at specific products. Have you reviewed that?
No, I actually haven't reviewed it.
All right, maybe Dan, you did some work on that along with others. I wonder if, Dan, if you have any impression to what degree are these kinds of things included in that? It may not be immediately appropriate, but could be. I wonder if you two could connect on that issue since you haven't been able to see that yet.
Yep, sure, I can do that. It doesn't mention climate risk specifically, but it could do quite easily.
Yeah, and maybe some of these other things. I know when it comes to climate change, which was an interesting learning point for me, just being in the South Pacific, that these things are, have become somewhat synonymous because the impact there is so large with, rising sea levels, increased numbers of storms, and so on. So pretty interesting times there. All right, if there's no other questions or comments, maybe we can wrap up. Saja, any final words?
Not really. So I look forward to look at that risk analysis document, and then so after I complete the technical paper, we can have some in-depth discussion on this. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Again, really useful learning experience. And thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Saja.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining this. Thank you.